Grace Lawson didn't knock the way a child knocks. She hit that door with her whole frozen fist 3 times hard, as she could manage, because her fingers had stopped working 2 miles back, and she was terrified that if she tapped too softly, the man inside would pretend he didn't hear. Lily was against her chest, wrapped in every scrap of cloth Grace had been able to tie around them both, and the baby had gone quiet in a way that scared her more than any crying ever had. 7 doors. 7 doors in 3 days, and every single one of them had closed in her face. This was the 8th. Grace Lawson was 10 years old. Her sister was 5 months old, and she was out of everything, out of time, out of warmth, out of hope, except for the thin curl of smoke rising from that chimney, which meant somebody was alive in there, and somebody alive meant one more chance. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let us begin. The door opened 2 inches before it stopped. One eye looked out at her through the gap, pale gray sharp-set, in a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week. The man didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her the way people look at something they aren't sure is real. Grace lifted her chin. She had practiced what she was going to say. She had rehearsed it while she walked, while the wind cut through her coat, while Lily slept fitfully against her shoulder. "Sir," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I ain't here to beg. I'm here to work." The man didn't move. "I can cook," Grace said. "I can clean. I can mend clothes, feed livestock, haul water, whatever needs doing. I'm stronger than I look." She paused. "And I won't cause you any trouble." Still nothing. "Please." She hated that word. She had promised herself she wouldn't use it. But Lily had gone so still against her chest, and the cold was so deep in her bones, and she was so tired. "Please, sir, my sister needs to get warm." The gray eyes dropped just for a second to the bundle pressed against Grace's coat. Something shifted in them. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was something older than that. Something that moved in him the way a fault line moves slow underground and impossible to stop once it started. The door opened. The man stepped back without a word, and Grace Lawson walked inside. The heat hit her like a wall. She hadn't realized how cold she truly was until warmth touched her face, and her eyes filled with tears she absolutely refused to let fall. She blinked them back hard. She was not going to cry in front of this stranger. She was not going to give him any reason to think she was weak. She stood just inside the doorway and took him in. He was tall, lean in the way men get when they work hard and eat little, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and hands that were calloused all the way up to the wrists. He wore no jacket, just a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, despite the December cold, like the cold didn't bother him, or like he'd stopped noticing it a long time ago. He was looking at Lily. "How old?" he said. His voice was low and rough, like it didn't get used much. 5 months, Grace said. He didn't say anything to that. He pulled a chair closer to the wood stove and gestured at it, the smallest possible gesture, barely more than a tilt of his chin, and Grace sat down, still holding Lily, and began to unwrap the layers of cloth around them both with fingers that trembled so badly she could barely manage the knots. When Lily's face came free, the man made a sound low in his throat that he seemed to catch before it fully escaped. The baby's cheeks were pale, waxy, pale, and her lips had a faint blue tinge that Grace had been trying very hard not to look at for the past hour. "She eat today?" the man asked. "Some," Grace said. "I found a farmhouse about 4 miles back. The woman there gave me some milk and a piece of cornbread. She wouldn't let us stay, but she gave us what she could." "She eat enough?" Grace didn't answer that. The silence was answer enough. The man crossed the room, opened a wooden cabinet, and pulled out a small pot. He moved without ceremony, without questions, and hung the pot over the stove. Grace watched him ladle milk into it from a stone crock on the shelf. She watched him stir it slow, and even never looking at her, his jaw set. "You got a name?" he said. "Grace. Grace Lawson." The baby's Lily. She paused. What's yours, sir, if you don't mind my asking? Mallister, he said. Samuel Mallister. You live alone, Mr. Mallister. I do. You got a wife. His stirring hand slowed just barely, just for the space of one heartbeat. Not anymore, he said. Grace understood enough not to ask the next question. She held Lily closer and turned her face toward the heat, and they sat in silence while the milk warmed. When it was ready, Samuel Mallister found a clean rag, dipped one corner into the warm milk, and held it out to Grace. She had done this before she had learned to do it in those first desperate weeks after Mama died, when Lily was too small for anything solid, and Grace had been the only one left to figure it out. She took the rag, pressed it gently to Lily's lips, and the baby latched onto it with a hunger that made Grace's throat tighten. "There you go," Grace whispered. "There you go, sweetheart." Samuel Mallister stood 3 feet back and watched. He didn't look away. After a while, Lily's color started coming back. It was slow, a flush creeping into her cheeks, her fingers uncurling from their frozen clench, but it was real, and Grace felt the knot in her chest begin just barely to loosen. "Thank you," she said. Samuel nodded once. "I meant what I said," Grace told him. "About work. I wasn't just talking. I genuinely will do whatever needs to be done on this farm. Cook, clean, repair, whatever." She shifted Lily to her other arm. "I know you got no reason to trust me. I know I'm just a child showing up at your door in the dark. But I keep my word, Mr. Mallister. I always have." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily like a man who'd been standing for too long. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. "Where you from?" he said. "Coleridge," Grace said. "North of here." "That's 30 miles. About that." "You walked from Coleridge?" "Yes, sir." "In December?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are your parents?" "Mama died in September," Grace said. She said it flat and clean, the way she had taught herself to say it, because if she let any feeling into the words, they cracked wide open, and she couldn't afford that right now. "Fever. Papa died 2 years before that. Mining accident." "You got kin—" Grace hesitated, just for a second. "An aunt," she said. "Daddy's sister. Her name's Prudence Whitfield. She lives over in Harlan County." "She know where you are?" "She does not," Grace said. "And I'd like to keep it that way." Samuel studied her. "Why?" Grace met his eyes without blinking. "Because she don't want us, Mr. Mallister. Not really. She wants what Mama left us. There's a small parcel of land outside Coleridge. It ain't much, but it's ours by deed and by law. Aunt Prudence has been trying to get her hands on it since before Mama was even cold in the ground. She came to the house 2 weeks after the funeral talking about taking us in, being so sweet and so sorry, and I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't looking at me and Lily, she was looking at that deed." Grace's jaw tightened. "I knew if I went with her that land would be gone inside of a month, and me and Lily would be nothing to her after that. So I packed what I could carry, and I left." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "You're 10 years old," he finally said. "Yes, sir." "And you walked 30 miles through a Nebraska winter with a 5-month-old baby." "I did." "Because you were afraid of your own aunt." "Because I knew what she was." Grace corrected him, and there was something in her voice right then that was not 10 years old at all. Something that had been worn down to its bone and come out harder on the other side. Samuel looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Lily, who had drifted into the deep boneless sleep of a baby who has finally gotten warm and full, her tiny fist curled against Grace's collarbone. "My wife died in childbirth," he said. He said it the same way Grace had talked about her mother, flat, clean, stripped of everything extra. 3 years ago, the baby too. He didn't look at Grace when he said it. He looked at the fire. "I ain't had anybody in this house since." Grace didn't say she was sorry. She had been told she was sorry so many times after her own mother died, and it had never once helped, not once. So she just said, "Yes, sir," quiet and even, and let the fire crackle between them. "I got a spare room," Samuel said. "Got a bed frame and a mattress. Ain't been aired in a while, but it's solid." "That's more than I need," Grace said. "I got a cow that needs milking twice a day. Got firewood that needs splitting and hauling. Got a barn that needs mucking, and 4 horses that need feeding and watering." He paused. "I ain't a man who asks for much, and I ain't a man who gives much, but I'll give you a fair chance. You work, you eat. You don't eat more than your share, and you don't go through my things. We clear?" "Crystal clear," Grace said. "One more thing." His gray eyes came back to her face. "You find that deed, and you put it somewhere safe first chance you get. Don't leave papers like that laying around where they can be found." Grace stared at him. "How did you know I had it?" "You walked 30 miles in December instead of going to a neighbor or a church," he said. "You were protecting something. Figured it wasn't just the baby." Grace reached into the inside of her coat where she had sewn a hidden pocket with her own hands 3 weeks ago, when she first started making her plans. She pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases from being carried so close to her body for so long. "I'll put it wherever you think is safest," she said. For the first time, just barely something moved in Samuel Mallister's face that was not quite a frown. It wasn't a smile either. It was something quieter than both, something that passed through his eyes like a cloud shadow passing over still water. "Good girl," he said, and he got up and went to find her a blanket. That night, Grace Lawson slept in a real bed for the first time in 2 weeks. Lily slept tucked against her, warm and full and breathing deep, and even her little chest rising and falling steady as a clock. Grace lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that this was not permanent, that she was not allowed to get used to this, that she was here to work and nothing else, and that the moment she let herself think of this place as safe was the moment she would get careless. But the fire in the next room was still going, and the wind outside sounded different when there were walls between you and it. And Lily's breathing was so peaceful, so perfectly peaceful. And Grace Lawson was 10 years old and had been carrying the whole world on her back for 3 months. And she was asleep before she finished her second thought. Samuel Mallister did not sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, and he did not drink it, and he stared at the wood grain in the tabletop, and he thought about a girl who walked 30 miles in December rather than trust the wrong person with something that mattered. He thought about a baby wrapped in layers of cloth, her lips going blue in the cold, her tiny fist clenched tight like she was already fighting for something, already holding on. He thought about his wife Clara, who had had the same quality about her, that particular kind of courage that didn't announce itself, that just quietly did what needed doing, no matter the cost. He thought about the son he had never gotten to hold, the boy who had lived for 8 minutes in this world and then been gone, and the way that grief had hollowed him out so completely that he hadn't been sure there was anything left worth keeping. He looked at the closed door of the spare room. He told himself this was a practical arrangement. The girl needed shelter. He needed help with the farm. It was simple arithmetic. It was nothing more than that. But when he finally got up and went to bed, he took the lamp with him and paused outside the spare room door for a moment, listening. He heard Lily breathing. He heard Grace shift in her sleep, murmur something too soft to make out. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went to his room, set the lamp on the nightstand, and lay down in the dark. In the morning, Grace was up before dawn. Samuel came out of his room to find the stove already going, a pot of oatmeal already on, and a small figure in a too large coat moving around his kitchen with the careful, efficient movements of someone who had been running a household since long before she was ready. Lily was in the middle of his kitchen table, in a nest of folded blankets, wide awake, making the small talking sounds that babies make when they are content and curious about the world, waving her fists at nothing. Grace looked up when he came in. "Milk's warming," she said. "I couldn't find where you keep the coffee. I'm sorry about that. And the oatmeal's plain. I didn't want to use anything without asking first." Samuel looked at the pot. He looked at the baby on his table, making small, happy sounds at the ceiling. He looked at this 10-year-old girl who had survived things that would have broken most grown men, who had walked across a Nebraska winter with a baby strapped to her chest and a land deed sewn inside her coat, and who was standing in his kitchen apologizing for not putting coffee on without asking. "Cabinet above the stove," he said. "Left side." "Yes, sir," Grace said, and she reached for it. They ate breakfast in the kind of quiet that is different from loneliness. Samuel had forgotten there was a difference. He ate his oatmeal and drank his coffee, and watched Grace feed Lily from the warmed rag with the focused patience of someone twice her age, and the kitchen felt less like a room he was just getting through and more like a room something was happening in. After breakfast, Grace washed the bowls without being asked, dried them, put them back exactly where she had found them, and turned to him with her hands folded. "Where do you want me to start?" she said. "Barn," he said. "Horses first, then the stall in the northeast corner. The hay in there needs pulling and replacing. And Lily," he thought for a moment. "Bring her. I got a wooden crate in the barn. We'll put some clean straw and a blanket in it, set her near the door where it's warmer." Grace nodded. "She likes the sounds," she said. "Animals wind people moving around. She don't like quiet. Quiet scares her." A small pause. "Me too, if I'm being honest." Samuel pulled on his coat and hat and said nothing to that. But when he held the back door open for Grace, he held it long enough that she and Lily were through before any cold air could catch them. The horses took to Grace immediately, which surprised him. Animals were usually suspicious of strangers. But the big bay mare he called Duchess dropped her head over the stall door the moment Grace appeared, and blew a warm breath against her cheek, and Grace laughed a real laugh, sudden and clear as a bell, the first time he had heard her make a sound like that, and lifted her hand to stroke Duchess's nose with the same gentle sureness she used with Lily. "She's beautiful," Grace said. "She's contrary and she kicks," Samuel said. "She seems sweet to me." "Give her a day." Grace looked at him sideways, just the edge of a look, and he would have sworn there was amusement in it. Then she turned back to Duchess and got to work. She worked hard. He had expected her to work hard. She had promised she would, and he had believed her, but there was something about watching it that still caught him off guard. She moved through the barn like she knew exactly what she was doing. Like work was not a burden, but a language she was fluent in, and she did not complain about the cold or the smell or the weight of the hay bales that were half her size. She just did it, again and again and again. Lily watched from the wooden crate, content and curious, and Duchess eventually condescended to sniff at the baby with great dignity, and Grace watched this with the kind of helpless delight that children show when the world turns out to be gentler than expected. Samuel found himself watching all of it. He found himself noticing things. The way Grace always checked on Lily between tasks. The way she thanked each horse quietly when she finished their stall like they were people who deserved to be acknowledged. The way her hands never completely stopped shaking, just the faintest tremor there, and gone like her body was still thawing from the inside out and hadn't quite finished yet. 3 months, he thought. 3 months of that. 3 months of cold and fear and closed doors and the weight of a baby who depended on her for everything. And she had not given up. She had not handed Lily over to someone else and saved herself. She had not done any of the reasonable, logical things that would have made her life easier. She had kept walking and knocking and asking for work. He didn't think about Clara. He did not allow himself to do that. He just pulled another hay bale into the empty stall and worked beside this 10-year-old girl who had shown up at his door with nothing but courage. And one name she refused to speak without contempt. And somewhere in the middle of all that cold gray morning light and the smell of horses and fresh hay and warm milk, something in Samuel Mallister that had been locked for 3 years shifted just slightly in its case. Not open, not yet, but less locked than it had been the day before. At noon, Grace went inside to warm the kitchen and start on something for lunch. Samuel stayed in the barn a minute longer, hands still on the pitchfork, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked at the wooden crate where Lily had spent the morning, the folded blanket Grace had tucked in so carefully, the tiny handprint pressed into the straw from where the baby had pushed herself up, and looked around with those big, solemn, wondering eyes. Samuel Mallister put down the pitchfork and went inside. And for the first time in 3 years, he sat down at a table that had food on it and felt something other than the absence of the people who used to sit there with him. Grace set a bowl in front of him without ceremony. Salt, pork, and beans, nothing fancy. Exactly what the pantry had offered up. She sat across from him with Lily in the crook of her left arm and a spoon in her right hand, and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. "Mr. Mallister," she said without looking up. "Yeah. Thank you for opening the door last night." She said it plain and direct the way she said everything. "I know you didn't have to." Samuel looked at his bowl. "No," he said. "I didn't. A lot of people didn't. I know." A pause. The fire popped. Lily grabbed Grace's spoon with both fists and tried to put it in her mouth, and Grace gently extracted it with the practiced patience of long habit. "I won't let you down," Grace said. She looked up then straight at him, and her eyes were brown and dark, and so much older than 10 that it made something ache in the back of his chest. "I promise you that. Whatever you need done on this farm, I will do it, and I will do it right. I will not take more than my share, and I will not be a burden. I just need a chance." Samuel Mallister looked at this child who had walked 30 miles in the dark to knock on a stranger's door and ask not for mercy, but for work. "You got it," he said. And that was how it started. 3 days passed before anyone in Holt County noticed the smoke coming a little thicker from Samuel Mallister's chimney. It was Mrs. Dora Hennessy who came first. She always came first. She was the kind of woman who called it neighborliness when the rest of the county called it something else entirely. And she arrived on the 4th morning with a covered dish and a pair of eyes sharp enough to split firewood. Grace heard the knock and looked at Samuel across the kitchen table. He set down his coffee cup. "Stay in here," he said. "I heard that," came a voice through the door, bright and carrying. "Samuel Mallister, I know you're alive in there, so you might as well answer this door before I freeze to death on your porch." Samuel opened the door. Mrs. Hennessy stepped in without being invited the way she always did, and her eyes swept the kitchen in one fast professional arc and landed on Grace the way a hawk lands on something small in an open field. "Well," she said. "Morning, Dora," Samuel said. "Morning." She was still looking at Grace. "And who is this Grace Lawson?" Grace said, standing up from the table, because her mother had taught her to stand when adults entered a room. "Ma'am?" "Lawson." Mrs. Hennessy turned the name over in her mouth like she was checking it for something. "I don't know any Lawsons around here." "We're from Coleridge," Grace said. "North. I know where Coleridge is." The woman's gaze dropped to the bundle in the wooden crate beside the stove where Lily was making her morning sounds, batting at the air with both fists. Mrs. Hennessy's expression did something complicated. "Lord in heaven! Samuel, is that a baby?" "It is," Samuel said. "Whose baby?" "Mine," Grace said. The word came out before she thought about it, fast and flat and final. "My sister. Her name is Lily." Mrs. Hennessy looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at her without expression. There was a long pause in which the fire crackled, and Lily said something urgent and incomprehensible to the ceiling. "Grace is helping around the farm," Samuel said, "in exchange for room and board. She's a child. She's a capable one." He took the covered dish from the woman's hands with a politeness that was also clearly a closing of the subject. "Thank you for the food, Dora." Mrs. Hennessy was not finished. She was never finished. "Samuel, people are going to talk. Let them. There are proper arrangements for children without Grace," he said, cutting across the woman's sentence without raising his voice. "Those horses won't water themselves." Grace looked at him. He gave her the smallest nod. She picked up Lily, bundled her against her chest, and went out the back without another word, and she did not look back at Mrs. Hennessy, but she listened hard as the door swung behind her, and she heard the woman say low and sharp, "Samuel, I am trying to help you understand the position you're putting yourself in." And she heard Samuel say quieter and harder than anything she had heard from him yet, "I understand my position fine. Good morning, Dora." The back door closed a minute later. Grace was already in the barn, one hand on Duchess's neck, breathing steady and deliberate, talking herself back down from the cold spike of fear that had gone through her at the words "proper arrangements." She had heard those words before. She knew what they meant. Samuel came in and stood at the barn door with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "She's going to tell people," Grace said. "She already has," Samuel said. "That's not news. Dora Hennessy has been reporting on this county's business since before you were born." "Mr. Mallister." "It don't matter," he said. He pushed off the door frame and went to the water barrel. "You earned your place here. That's all anyone needs to know." Grace watched him work. He moved like a man who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it, and something about that settled into her chest like a warm stone. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, and she went back to work. The days built on each other with the quiet insistence of snowfall, one thing on top of another, until you looked up and the whole landscape had changed without you noticing the moment it happened. Grace cooked breakfast every morning and had it ready when Samuel came in from the early chores. She cleaned the kitchen, swept the floors, mended 2 shirts and a pair of work trousers. She found folded at the back of the hall closet, stitching the seams back together with the small, precise movements her mother had taught her. She hauled water, fed the chickens, learned which of the horses liked their ears rubbed and which would rather be left alone. Lily grew. It happened the way it always does overnight, and impossible, so that one morning Grace looked at her sister, and the baby she saw was not quite the baby. From 3 days ago, there was more in her face, more attention, more of that particular brand of infant seriousness that looks so much like judgment. Lily had started watching Samuel. Really watching him. Her eyes tracked him across the room the way they tracked firelight, with a focused, wondering attention that was entirely unself-conscious. Samuel pretended not to notice, but he noticed. The first time Lily reached for him, he was standing at the kitchen counter, and Grace was at the table, and Lily was in her crate making sounds. And all at once the baby went quiet and extended one small arm in his direction. Fingers spread and made a sound that was halfway between a demand and a question. Samuel stopped moving. Grace looked up. He stood there with his back half turned to the room and his hands still on the counter, and she could see from where she sat that he was not breathing quite right. "You can hold her," Grace said, careful, like she was saying it to someone who might bolt. "She won't break." "I know she won't break," he said. "Then go ahead." He didn't answer. But after a moment, slowly, with the particular carefulness of a man who is afraid of wanting something, he crossed the room, bent down and picked Lily up. Lily grabbed a fistful of his flannel shirt and pulled the way babies do, fierce and proprietary, like she was claiming something that already belonged to her. She looked up at his face with those wide, dark eyes and made a sound of pure satisfaction. Samuel stood absolutely still. Grace did not say a word. She looked down at the shirt she was mending, and she put her needle through the cloth very deliberately, and she did not look up, because some moments are so fragile that even a glance can shatter them, and this was one of those moments, and she knew it. From the corner of her eye she saw him sit down at the table. She heard the creak of the chair. She heard the small sounds Lily made when she was content, that particular breathy cooing that had kept Grace company through the darkest parts of the last 3 months. She heard Samuel say very quietly to no one in particular, "She's got good eyes." "She does," Grace said, looking at her mending. "Mama always said she'd be the sharp one." A pause. "And you?" Grace permitted herself the smallest smile. "Mama said I'd be the stubborn one." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, but the first cousin of one. The sound of a man who has not laughed in so long that his body has to remember the mechanics of it. Grace kept her head down and kept sewing, and she let that small sound sit in the kitchen between them without touching it. It was that same evening after Lily was asleep and the supper dishes were put away that Grace found the cradle. She hadn't been snooping. She had gone to the back of the hallway for more lamp oil, reached for the storage shelf, and her hand found wood. Instead, curved smooth, the kind of craftsmanship that takes time and care. the kind a man makes himself when he is building toward something. She pulled it forward into the lamplight, without thinking, and when she understood what it was, she stood very still with her hands on it, and felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with the wood. Samuel appeared in the hallway doorway. He saw her hands on the cradle. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The lamp threw long shadows. "I can put it back," Grace said. "Leave it," he said. His voice was even. "It's been sitting there long enough." "Mr. Mallister." "Grace." He said her name the way he said most things, short, direct, no excess in it. "Go to bed." "Yes, sir." She set the lamp down and went to her room and closed the door, and she lay in the dark, listening to the sound of him moving around in the hallway, and then the sound of something being carried, and a door opening and a door closing. In the morning, the cradle was in the kitchen next to the stove, and Lily was sleeping in it. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a long time. Then she went and put the coffee on, and when Samuel came in from the barn, she handed him a cup without comment, and he took it without comment, and they had breakfast in their usual quiet, and neither of them said a word about the cradle, and that was perfectly all right. It was the kind of thing that didn't need words. The letter came on a Thursday. Grace was in the barn when she heard the rider, the sound of hooves on frozen ground, and then voices Samuel's and a stranger's brief and low. She came to the barn door and saw the back of a man on horseback already riding away, and Samuel standing in the yard with something in his hand, a sealed envelope. He was looking at it the way people look at things they already know are trouble. He turned before she could step back, and their eyes met across the yard. Something in his face told her everything before he said a single word. "Who's it from?" she said. He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. "Mr. Mallister?" Her voice had gone flat and hard the way it always did when she was most afraid. "Who is that letter from?" He crossed the yard to her, stopped a few feet away, looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that had gotten a little less closed over the past weeks, and then held the envelope out without a word. She took it. Her name was not on it. The letter was addressed to Samuel, care of the Harlan County postal route, but the name in the upper left corner was written in a hand she would have recognized from 100 yards away, tight and precise and proprietary as a legal document. Prudence Whitfield. Grace looked at it and said nothing. She turned it over once in her hands. The wax seal on the back bore the initials P.W. pressed in deep. "You didn't open it," she said. "It came an hour ago," he said. "I brought it straight out here." She broke the seal. The letter was short. Prudence Whitfield did not waste words any more than she wasted anything else, and what she had written was precise and cold and completely clear in its intent. She had heard through the proper channels that her deceased brother's children were residing at the Mallister farm in Holt County. She wished to inform Mr. Mallister that she held legal responsibility for the welfare of both minors, and that she intended to collect them within the fortnight. She further wished to inform him that any interference with this collection would be viewed as an obstruction of lawful guardianship and dealt with accordingly. She sent her regards. Grace read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases very neatly, very carefully, and held it in both hands. "She found us," she said. "Seems like." "Mrs. Hennessy," Grace said. Not accusation, just fact placed in the air between them. "Most likely." Grace looked down at the letter. Her hands were not shaking. She had made herself stop shaking 2 months ago, back when shaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. "She can't just take us," she said. "The law don't work like that. She'd have to prove guardianship. She'd have to go before a judge." "She would," Samuel said. "Then she'll do it." Grace looked up. "She has money, and she has connections, and she's been planning this since before Mama died. She'll find a judge who'll give her what she wants." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Maybe not." "You don't know, Aunt Prudence." "I don't," he said. "But I know judges, and I know what a land deed says when it's been properly recorded." He paused. "Grace, where's the deed right now?" "Inside cover of my coat," she said immediately. "Same place it's been every day. He nodded slowly. Good. He looked at the letter in her hands. Let her come. Grace stared at him. Mr. Mallister. I said let her come. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it she had not heard before. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something older and heavier and considerably more dangerous than either. She'll come here, she'll talk to me, and then she'll go talk to a judge. And when she does, she'll find out that I've already talked to one first. Grace went very still. What do you mean? There's a lawyer in town, Samuel said. Dan Forsyth. Honest man, which is rarer than it ought to be. I was going to ride in Friday anyway for supplies. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice had gone back to its usual flatness, stripped of everything extra. I'll talk to him about guardianship. The word dropped into the air between them like a stone into still water, and Grace felt the ripples of it move through her whole body. For us? She said. He looked at her steadily. For both of you, he said. Grace Lawson had not cried once since the morning she buried her mother. She had made herself a promise that day, standing in the cold November churchyard with Lily on her hip, that she would not spend another tear until she had found solid ground. She stood in Samuel Mallister's yard now with Prudence Whitfield's letter in her hands, and solid ground finally beneath her feet, and she kept that promise, same as she kept every promise she had ever made. But it was close. It was the closest it had been in 3 months. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, Samuel said. It'll cost you. Not just money, it'll cost you time and talk and trouble. I expect it will. Why? She said. We ain't your blood. We ain't your responsibility. You don't owe us anything. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her toward the farmhouse, toward the window where the light from the kitchen fire threw a warm square against the gray December air. And inside that square, if you stood at the right angle, you could just see the edge of the wooden cradle where Lily was sleeping. No, he said. I don't. He picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it, pulled it on, and walked back toward the barn. But I'm doing it anyway, he said without turning around. Dan Forsyth was a small man with a big desk and the kind of calm that came from having seen the worst of people for 30 years and deciding not to be surprised by any of it anymore. Samuel had ridden into town on Friday the way he said he would, and he had sat in that office for an hour, and when he rode home, he had a folder of papers under his arm and an expression on his face that Grace could not quite read. She was waiting on the porch when he came back. She had told herself she would not wait on the porch. Well, she said. He swung down from the horse and handed her the reins. Out of habit, she had been taking his horse since the first week. It had just become the way things were done, and he tucked the folder under his arm and climbed the porch steps. Forsyth says the case is solid, he said. The deed is clean. Your mama's will names you as Lily's guardian, not Prudence. The court in Coleridge already recorded it. He stopped at the door and looked at her. He also says Prudence Whitfield hired herself a lawyer out of Omaha. Man named Caldwell. Forsyth knows him. Is that bad? Forsyth says Caldwell wins cases he shouldn't. He paused. He also says Caldwell's never gone up against a properly recorded guardianship with a willing co-petitioner. Grace turned that word over. Co-petitioner, she said. That's you. That's me. Mr. Mallister. She handed the horse off to the post and looked up at him directly. You understand that if this goes to a judge, your name goes on record, permanently, associated with 2 orphaned girls and a custody dispute. I understand that. People in this town already talk? Let them talk louder, he said, and went inside. Forsyth filed the co-petition on Monday. By Wednesday, every soul in Holt County knew about it. By Thursday morning, Prudence Whitfield was standing at Samuel Mallister's front gate. Grace heard the carriage first. The sound of wheels on frozen ground. The particular clip of horses that had been well kept and well fed. Nothing like the tired animals of working farms. She was at the kitchen window when she saw it stop, and she went still the way she always went still when danger arrived. That particular animal stillness that had kept her alive through 3 months of closed doors and cold nights. "Mr. Mallister," she called quiet and level. He was already coming out of the back hallway, coat half on, like he had heard the carriage too. She turned from the window and looked at him. "She's here." He finished buttoning his coat. "Stay inside." "No," Grace said. He stopped, looked at her. "She's here for me and Lily," Grace said. "I'll stand beside you or I'll stand behind you, but I will not hide in the kitchen while someone decides my sister's life through a closed door." A beat. Then he nodded once and opened the front door. Prudence Whitfield was exactly as Grace remembered her, tall, straight-backed, dressed in dark wool that fit like armor, with a face that would have been handsome if it had ever been soft. She had a man with her younger, carrying a leather case, Caldwell, Grace assumed, or someone who worked for him. She came through the gate without knocking and stopped 10 feet from the porch, and when she saw Grace standing at Samuel's shoulder, her expression did not change, which was almost worse than if it had. "Grace," she said, "you look thin." "I look healthy," Grace said. "Ma'am?" Prudence's eyes moved to Samuel. "Mr. Mallister, I'm Prudence Whitfield. I believe you've had a letter from me." "I have," Samuel said. "Then you know why I'm here." "I do. And you know why my name is on file with the county court." Something moved in Prudence's face. "A foolish decision," she said, and her voice was smooth and reasoned, the voice of someone who has practiced being reasonable for a very long time. "Mr. Mallister, I understand you've been generous to my nieces. That speaks well of you. But you are a single man with no family of your own, and these are 2 young children who deserve proper care and a proper home. My home." "Your home," Grace said. Prudence looked at her. "Yes. The same home you wrote to us from twice after Mama got sick, asking her to sign over the Coleridge land before she died." The temperature dropped. It dropped from somewhere inside Prudence Whitfield, something that had been cold long before December. "You are 10 years old," Prudence said softly. "You don't understand legal arrangements." "I understand what I read," Grace said, "and I can read real well for 10. Samuel put one hand on Grace's shoulder, not pulling her back, not silencing her. Just there, present, a hand that said, "I'm beside you." Prudence looked at that hand. Then she looked at Samuel. "I have a court date," she said. "Judge Harmon, 2 weeks from Friday in Ainsworth. I suggest you bring your paperwork." She looked at the man with the leather case. "We're done here." She turned and walked back through the gate, and the carriage wheels turned on the frozen ground, and Grace stood on the porch and watched until they were gone, and then she let out a breath she had been holding for 3 full minutes. "Judge Harmon," she said. "I know him," Samuel said. "Is he honest?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "He's a man," he said, "which means he can go either way depending on who makes the better argument." He looked down at her. "Which is why you're going to talk to Forsyth tomorrow, and you're going to tell him everything, every letter, every visit, every word your aunt said to your mama about that land. Everything." "I remember all of it," Grace said. "I know you do." She looked out at the empty road. "She's going to say I'm too young to know what's good for me." "She's going to say a lot of things," Samuel said. "That don't make any of them true." The 2 weeks before the hearing were the longest of Grace's life, and that was saying something considerable, given the last 3 months. She talked to Forsyth twice, sitting in that big desk office with Lily on her lap, going through every detail she could pull from memory, with the same focused precision she applied to everything. Forsyth wrote things down, and asked questions, and nodded, and wrote more things down, and when she was done, he looked at her over the top of his glasses and said, "Young lady, I have taken depositions from grown men who weren't half as clear as you." "My mama taught me to be thorough," Grace said. "Your mama, Forsyth, said, taught you well." The night before the hearing, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark, listening to Lily breathe in the cradle. Samuel's cradle, the one he had made with his own hands for a child who never got to use it, and which now held the most important thing in Grace's world. and she stared at the ceiling and went through everything in her head. Every argument, every document, every word she planned to say when they put her in that chair. She heard Samuel moving in the kitchen. She was not surprised. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and went out. He was at the table with a cup of coffee and the folder of papers from Forsyth spread out in front of him, and he looked up when she appeared. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you," she said. He didn't argue that. She sat down across from him, and he poured her a small cup of coffee without comment, and she held it in both hands for the warmth. "What happens if we lose?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "We don't lose. But if we do—" "Grace. Mr. Mallister, I have been planning for the worst case since I was 7 years old. I need to know what the worst case is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "If the judge rules for Prudence, she gets temporary custody. Then Forsyth appeals. Then we get a second hearing with a broader record." He paused. "It doesn't end with one ruling. That's what people like Prudence count on, that the other side will give up because the road is long. We don't give up." "No," Grace agreed. "We don't. So stop planning for the worst case," he said, "and go back to bed." She didn't go back to bed. But she stopped talking about worst cases, which was close enough. The courthouse in Ainsworth was a plain building with a high ceiling and wooden benches that had held this county's disputes for 20 years. It was fuller than Grace expected. She walked in beside Samuel with Lily bundled against her chest, and she felt every eye in the room find her, and she lifted her chin and kept walking. Mrs. Hennessy was there. Grace saw her in the third row and felt a jolt of cold before she realized the woman was sitting on their side of the aisle. She caught Grace's eye and gave one firm nod, the nod of someone who has decided where they stand after spending time on the fence, and Grace nodded back. There were others. She recognized the man from the feed store who had given Samuel a long look the day they came in for supplies together, the woman from the church who had smiled at Lily through the window. Small acknowledgments, small solidarities. Grace had not known people were watching. People were always watching. Prudence sat at the opposite table with Caldwell and 2 associates and a stack of documents that suggested she had been building this case for considerably longer than 2 weeks. Judge Harmon was older than Grace had imagined, with white hair and a face like cured leather, and eyes that moved around the room with a slow assessing intelligence that reminded her unexpectedly of Samuel. Caldwell went first. He was good. Grace had to give him that. He was smooth and methodical, and he made Prudence sound like mercy itself, a devoted family member, seeking only to fulfill her lawful duty to 2 bereaved children who had been through a series of unfortunate circumstances, placed in the care of an unrelated single man on an isolated farm. He said the word unrelated 3 times. He said isolated twice. He never said anything that was technically a lie, which Grace recognized as a particular kind of skill. Then Forsyth stood up. He presented the deed first properly recorded, properly witnessed, naming Grace as the surviving party of interest upon her mother's death. He presented the will which named Grace as Lily's guardian, with explicit language that had been drafted. Forsyth noted by a Coleridge attorney 3 months before Eleanor Lawson died, at a time when she was of entirely sound mind. He presented 2 of Prudence's own letters, the ones Grace had kept folded in the inside pocket of her coat, alongside the deed carried through 30 miles of Nebraska winter, because some part of her had always known they would matter. He read one sentence from the first letter aloud, and he did not have to read more than that, because the sentence made the thing perfectly clear. Prudence sat at her table with the composure of a woman who has been planning for complications, and has encountered one she did not fully anticipate. Caldwell leaned to her ear, and she listened, and her jaw tightened by a fraction, and she nodded. Then Judge Harmon said, "I'd like to hear from the child." Grace had known this was possible. Forsyth had told her it was possible. She had practiced what she was going to say, sitting at Samuel's kitchen table with Lily in her lap, and Samuel across from her listening, not interrupting, just listening. She handed Lily to Samuel. Now he took her without hesitation and Lily grabbed his lapel with both fists, the way she always did, proprietary and certain, and Grace walked to the chair at the front of the room. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Judge Harmon. "Grace," the judge said, and his voice was not unkind. "Can you tell me in your own words why you left your aunt's care?" "I was never in my aunt's care," Grace said. "My mama died in September. My aunt came to the house in October. She didn't ask how me and Lily were doing. She asked about the land deed. She asked 3 times in one afternoon. When I told her I didn't know where Mama kept the papers, she looked at me like she knew I was lying." Grace paused. "I was lying. I knew exactly where the papers were. Mama showed me the summer before she died. She told me to keep them safe no matter what, because that land was mine and Lily's, and nobody had the right to take it. And you believed your aunt intended to take it." "She said so," Grace said. "Not out loud, but she said it in her letters. Your Honor, I can read. I have been able to read since I was 5. My mama made sure of that. And what my aunt wrote in those letters was not the language of someone who wanted to take care of 2 children. It was the language of someone who wanted to take care of a land deed." Silence in the room. Complete weighted silence. "And Mr. Mallister," the judge said carefully, "you went to him." "He was the 8th door I knocked on," Grace said. "In 3 days, in December." She let that sit for a moment. "He was the only one who opened it all the way." She heard someone in the benches behind her make a sound, not quite a word, just a breath that meant something. She didn't look back. "He gave us shelter," she said. "He gave us food and warmth. He let me work for it, which is what I asked for, because I don't take charity. Neither did my mama. Neither will I." She looked at Judge Harmon steadily. "He filed that co-petition because he chose to. Nobody asked him to. Nobody pushed him. He rode to town on his own, and he talked to a lawyer on his own, because he decided that we were worth protecting." A pause. "My aunt has blood rights. I understand that's what the law says. But my mama also said that family is the people who show up when it costs them something. By that measure, Mr. Mallister is more family to me and Lily than Prudence Whitfield has ever tried to be." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of a room full of people who have just heard something said plainly, that they had been thinking in complicated circles, and the plainness of it has settled something in them. Then Caldwell said smoothly, and with the timing of a man who has done this many times, "Your Honor, may I ask the child one question?" The judge nodded. Caldwell stood. He was tall, well-dressed, with a pleasant face that Grace did not trust for a single second. "Grace," he said, and his voice was gentle, the voice of someone who is not actually being gentle. "You're 10 years old." "Yes, sir." "And you've been living with a man you met 4 weeks ago." "Yes, sir." "A man you knew nothing about, a stranger." "He isn't a stranger anymore," Grace said. "He was a stranger for about an hour." A sound from the benches, not laughter exactly, but its first cousin. Caldwell pressed on. "Grace, don't you think a young woman of your aunt's standing with a proper house and proper resources would be better equipped to care for you and your sister than a single farmer who—" "No," Grace said. Caldwell blinked. He had not expected the interruption. People rarely interrupted him. "No," Grace said again, and her voice did not waver. "Because equipment isn't the same as care. My aunt has resources. I don't doubt that. But resources aren't what kept Lily warm when she was turning blue in the cold. Resources aren't what got up before dawn to put oatmeal on so I wouldn't have to. Resources aren't what drove to town to talk to a lawyer when there wasn't anybody telling him he had to." She looked at Caldwell with the particular directness of someone who has run out of patience for indirect things. "You're asking me whether I'd rather have money or have somebody who shows up, and the answer is the same as it's always been." Caldwell sat down. Judge Harmon looked at his papers for a long moment. Then he looked up, and his eyes went to Samuel, who was sitting in the front row with Lily on his knee, and one large hand curved around her back, steady and certain, and Lily was looking at the judge with her wide, dark eyes, and her fist wrapped around Samuel's lapel. "Mr. Mallister," the judge said. Samuel stood. "You understand what you're taking on?" "I do," Samuel said. "This isn't a temporary arrangement you're asking for." "No, sir, it is not." The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Prudence Whitfield, who sat very straight and very still, with the expression of a woman who is beginning to understand that she has miscalculated, and that the miscalculation may not be correctable. "I've heard enough," Judge Harmon said, and he reached for his papers, and the room went so quiet that Grace could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, steady and hard, and very much alive. Judge Harmon set down his pen and looked at the room over the tops of his glasses, the way a man looks when he has made up his mind and wants everyone to understand that clearly before he speaks. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said, and his voice was measured and deliberate, each word placed like a stone. "And in those 19 years, I have seen a great many people come into this courtroom claiming to act in the best interest of a child." He paused. "Most of them were acting in the best interest of something else entirely." He looked at Prudence Whitfield for exactly 1 second, no more, no less, and then looked back at his papers. The petition for guardianship filed by Samuel Mallister, co-signed by the minor child Grace Lawson, is consistent with the recorded will of Eleanor Lawson and with the documented circumstances of both children's welfare. I am granting it. The room exhaled. Grace felt it move through her body like the first warm air after a long winter. Not dramatic, not loud, just real, just done. She sat very still in the chair at the front of the room and breathed. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The land deed recorded in the name of Grace and Lily Lawson remains the exclusive property of those minors under the stewardship of their legal guardian. No claim against that deed will be entertained by this court." He looked up. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down. Prudence Whitfield did not move for a moment. Then she turned to Caldwell and said something in a voice too low for Grace to catch, and Caldwell nodded smooth and unreadable and began collecting his papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has lost before and knows exactly what to do next. That unhurried efficiency was what scared Grace. She crossed the room to Forsyth, who was already shaking hands with Samuel, and she put her hand on the lawyer's arm. "He's not done," she said quietly. "Caldwell, he's already planning something." Forsyth looked at her with those steady eyes. "Most likely," he said. "What can he do? File an appeal, challenge the jurisdiction, question the competency of the original will." He paused. "He won't win. But he can make the road longer." "How much longer?" Forsyth glanced at Samuel, then back at Grace. "Could be months. Could be a year." He lowered his voice. "But here's what you need to understand. Grace, every step he takes costs Prudence money, and every step we take costs Samuel money. At some point, one side runs out of will to keep going." He looked at her directly. "My experience is that the side with something real to fight for lasts longer." Grace thought about that. Then she nodded and went to Samuel, who was holding Lily against his shoulder with the natural ease of someone who had been doing it for years rather than weeks, and she stood beside him and let herself feel just for a moment the solid reality of that. "We won," she said. "We won today," he said. Not to diminish it, just to name it accurately. He looked down at her. "You ready to go home?" The word home landed in her chest and stayed there. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The ride back was quiet in the way that follows something enormous. Not empty quiet, but full quiet. The kind that has too much in it for ordinary words. Grace sat in the wagon with Lily in her lap and watched the frozen Nebraska sky and thought about her mother, who had sat at a kitchen table 3 months before she died and made sure every piece of paper was in order, who had shown Grace where the deed was kept and made her memorize the name of the lawyer in Coleridge, and said very quietly, "I need you to be strong enough for both of you, if it comes to that." It had come to that. Grace thought her mother might have liked Samuel Mallister. She thought Eleanor Lawson would have recognized in him the same quality she had tried to build into her daughter, that particular steadiness that does not announce itself, that simply holds when everything else is moving. "Mr. Mallister," Grace said. "Yeah. Thank you." She had said it before back at the beginning. She said it again now because it meant something different than it had then. For all of it. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something mattered to him, and he was deciding how much of that to let show. "You did the hard part," he said finally. "We both did," Grace said. He looked at her sideways. Then he looked back at the road. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon we did." They were half a mile from the farm when Grace saw it. The gate was standing open. Samuel saw it at the same moment she felt him go still beside her, the subtle change in the way he held the reins. He did not speed up. He pulled the horse to a slow walk, his eyes moving over the yard with the careful attention of a man reading something written in a language most people don't know. "Someone's been here," Grace said. "Maybe." He kept his voice even. "Stay in the wagon until I say." He climbed down and walked to the gate and looked at it, the latch, the hinges, the ground around the post. Then he walked toward the house with a stillness that was not calm so much as coiled, and Grace sat in the wagon with Lily pressed against her, and her heart doing something hard and fast against her ribs. He came back 2 minutes later. "Nothing taken," he said. "Nothing broken." He looked at the gate again. "Somebody walked the property, looked around, that's all." "Prudence," Grace said. "Her people," he said. "Checking what's here, what can be counted and valued." His jaw tightened just slightly. "Let them count it." Grace climbed down from the wagon and latched the gate herself firmly with both hands, and it occurred to her that this was the first time she had ever done that, latched this particular gate, as though she had the right to, and the feeling of it was so strange and so right at the same time that it took her breath for a second. She turned and followed Samuel into the house. That evening, after Lily was asleep in the cradle and the supper dishes were washed, Samuel sat down at the table with a piece of paper and a pen and pushed them across to Grace. She looked at them. "What's this?" "I want you to write down every piece of property on this land," he said. "Every tool, every animal, every structure, date, description, condition." He paused. "And I want you to write down every interaction you ever had with Prudence Whitfield. Every visit, every letter, every word you can remember. Date and detail." Grace looked at him. "You're building a record. Forsyth said an appeal could take a year. I want a year's worth of documentation ready before they can ask for it." He met her eyes. "You've got the best memory I've ever seen in a person half my age. Use it." Grace pulled the paper toward her and picked up the pen. "I'll need more than 1 page," she said. "I know," he said, and got up to get her more. She wrote for 2 hours that night, while Samuel sat across from her reading the legal papers Forsyth had sent home with them, occasionally asking a question, occasionally making a note of his own. Lily slept. The fire burned. Outside, the December wind moved across the Nebraska plain with its flat and patient indifference, and inside the farmhouse, the lamp threw its warm circle of light, and 2 people who had chosen each other deliberately and against considerable odds worked side by side on the business of keeping what they had built. It was, Grace thought, the most ordinary evening she had ever spent. It was also the best. January came, and with it the news from Forsyth that Caldwell had indeed filed a notice of intent to appeal. It was, Forsyth said, largely procedural, a delay tactic, an attempt to extend the pressure until one side broke. Samuel read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and picked up his coffee cup and said, "All right," and that was the entirety of his reaction. Grace looked at him. "That's it. All right." What else would I say? Most people would say something stronger than that. Most people, Samuel said, waste a lot of energy on feelings that don't change the outcome. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "We've got a record. We've got documentation. We've got Forsyth." A pause. "We've got the truth, which helps." "The truth doesn't always win," Grace said. "No," he said. "But it wins more often than people think when somebody's willing to keep telling it." 2 weeks after the ruling, Grace Lawson started school. It was Samuel who drove her, which she had not expected. She had assumed she would walk. The schoolhouse was only 1.5 miles. She had walked farther than that without thinking about it. But he came out of the barn on the first morning with the wagon already hitched, and looked at her standing on the porch with her coat buttoned and her hair braided and said, "Get in." She got in. They didn't talk much on the way. But when he stopped the wagon in front of the schoolhouse and she climbed down with her book and her lunch pail, he said, "Grace." She looked back. "If anybody gives you trouble," he said, "you tell the teacher. And if the teacher don't handle it, you tell me." She looked at him for a moment. "What will you do?" "I'll handle it," he said. She believed him completely. "Yes, sir," she said, and went inside. The teacher, Miss Abernathy, was young and serious, and treated Grace with the particular careful courtesy of someone who has heard a story and is trying very hard to act as though she hasn't. The other children were less subtle. There were whispers she caught fragments of them, words like orphan and that Mallister girl, and reckoned she ain't even really his, and she kept her chin up and her eyes forward and did her work because her mother had told her that the best answer to people who underestimate you is excellence. And Grace Lawson had always been an excellent student. At the end of the first day, she came out of the schoolhouse to find Samuel's wagon already there. He was leaning against it with his arms crossed, and his hat pulled low, the way he stood when he was waiting for something, and had decided to be patient about it. 3 children who had been whispering about her all day stopped and looked at him. He tipped his hat to Miss Abernathy, who was seeing children out, and said, "Afternoon, ma'am," and then looked at Grace and said, "Good day." "Good enough," Grace said, and climbed into the wagon. She heard one of the whispering children say quietly to another, "He came to get her." And the way it was said surprised, almost awed, told her everything about what that meant in this county, in this town, in this particular world, where showing up was not something people took for granted. The appeal from Caldwell arrived on the last Friday of January. Forsyth brought it himself, which told Grace before she even read it that there was something in it worth being worried about. He sat at Samuel's kitchen table with his coat still on and his hat in his hands, and he laid the document out flat and said, "They found something." Samuel sat down. Grace stood. "The original land deed," Forsyth said. "The recording in Coleridge. There's a clerical error in the registration, a transposed number in the parcel identifier. It doesn't affect the legal ownership, but it gives Caldwell grounds to challenge the document's standing in this jurisdiction." He looked at Samuel. "He's going to argue the deed is improperly recorded, and therefore the will's language regarding the land is unenforceable." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Can he win that argument? In front of the right judge, possibly. Forsyth paused. "Not in front of Harmon, but Caldwell's petition is to move the case to a different court, a higher one." The kitchen was very quiet. Grace looked at the document on the table. She looked at the numbers, found the error. It took her about 4 seconds, and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear, but was its next-door neighbor. "How long do we have?" Samuel said. 30 days to file a response." Samuel nodded. He looked at Grace. She looked back at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the recognition shared and solid, that this was not over, that it had never been quite over, that Prudence Whitfield was the kind of person who treated obstacles as invitations to try harder. "File the response," Samuel said to Forsyth. "And in the response include a motion to have the deed re-recorded with the corrected identifier. We fix the error ourselves before they can use it." Forsyth blinked. Then he smiled, slow, impressed. "That's a good instinct." "It's common sense," Samuel said. "You don't give people a weapon by leaving it lying around." Grace looked at him. In 3 words, she understood exactly what he had done. He had listened during all those hours they had spent building the record. He had listened to everything she told him about how Prudence worked, about the way her aunt moved around problems by finding the smallest crack and pressing until it opened. And he had taken that knowledge and used it, and standing there in the kitchen, watching him talk to Forsyth with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, Grace felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with legal documents. She trusted him, not the way you trust someone who has given you no reason not to. The other kind. The kind that is built day by day in small moments and early mornings, and hands on shoulders and horses watered and oatmeal made and cradles moved from hallways into kitchens. The kind that costs something to build and means something because of that cost. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table beside him. "I want to help," she said. With the response, "Whatever you need, written, documented, organized, tell me what to do." Forsyth looked at her with those steady eyes. "You know," he said, "in about 8 years, you'd make a fine lawyer." "In about 8 years," Grace said, "I intend to be one." Both men looked at her. "Mama said the law belongs to everybody," Grace said. "She just said most people don't know that yet." Forsyth picked up his hat and stood. "I'll have the draft response ready by Wednesday," he said to Samuel. "And I'll file the re-recording motion the same day." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I've been doing this a long time. I know what it looks like when somebody is fighting for something real, and I know what it looks like when somebody is fighting for something they think they're entitled to." He looked from Samuel to Grace and back. "The right side wins more often than not. And you're the right side." He left. Samuel stayed at the table. Grace stayed at the table. Lily in her cradle made a sound of general satisfaction with the world and waved both fists at nothing. After a while, Samuel said, "You meant that, about becoming a lawyer." "I meant every word," Grace said. He was quiet. Then he said, "Good," and got up to put more wood on the fire, and Grace sat at the table and looked at the document that Prudence Whitfield had sent to undo them, and she picked up her pen and she began to write. Forsyth filed both motions on Wednesday. The re-recording was approved by the end of the week. Caldwell's appeal, stripped of its central argument, was restructured and refiled 2 weeks later in a form that Forsyth described as increasingly desperate. The higher court declined to accept jurisdiction. The original ruling held. The letter from Caldwell informing Prudence of that decision arrived, according to Forsyth, on a Tuesday in early February. Forsyth did not describe Prudence's reaction because he had not been there to see it. But he heard through the proper channels that she had not responded well. She did not file again. Not that month, not the next, not the one after that. Grace did not celebrate. She did not trust silence from Prudence Whitfield the way most people trust it. But as March came and the ground began its slow thaw and the days lengthened by their small daily increments and nothing arrived through the mail that required Forsyth's attention, she began carefully, incrementally, the way you lower your weight onto ice you're not sure will hold, to believe that maybe this time they had held. One afternoon in March, Grace came home from school to find Samuel in the yard. He was standing at the gate which he had spent the better part of a Saturday repairing 2 weeks back. New wood, new hardware, rehung straight and true. He was looking at it with his arms crossed and his head tilted, the way he looked at things he had fixed, and was checking his own work. Grace stopped beside him. They both looked at the gate. "It was crooked when I got here," she said. "It was crooked long before that," he said. "Looks good now." "Hangs right," he said. "Closes clean." Grace reached out and put her hand on the latch, the same latch she had fastened the day they came home from the courthouse, the day she first touched it like it was hers. She pushed it open, then swung it closed, and it settled into its catch with a clean, solid sound. "Yes," she said, "it does." Samuel looked at her sideways. Then he looked back at the gate. Something in his face was quieter than it used to be, not closed the way it had been in December, but settled, the way a house settles when it has been lived in long enough. "Grace," he said. "Sir, you did good, through all of it." He said it the way he said important things, plain, no decoration, every word meaning exactly what it said. "Your mama would be proud." Grace held the latch for a moment longer. Then she let it go. "She is," Grace said with the simple certainty of a child who has decided some things are true, regardless of evidence to the contrary. "I know she is." They walked back to the house together, and the gate stood straight and solid behind them. And inside, Lily was awake in her cradle, making the sounds that meant she was hungry, and prepared to make her feelings on the subject very widely known. And Samuel moved ahead to get the milk warming, and Grace took off her coat and hung it on its hook by the door. The same hook she had been using since December. The same hook that had always been hers, and somewhere beneath all the relief and exhaustion and quiet, hard-won peace, She felt the thing she had been walking toward for 3 months solid ground finally beneath her feet, and she let herself stand on it. Spring came to the Mallister farm the way it always did in Nebraska. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a door thrown open after a long time locked. The frozen ground gave the sky stretched itself wide and blue, and one morning Grace Lawson woke up at the age of 13 and understood that she had been living in this house for 3 years, and that it fit her the way a home fits a person when they have finally stopped waiting to be asked to leave. Lily was 3 years old and running. That was the only word for it, running. She ran to the barn, she ran to the fence, she ran to Samuel's legs and grabbed them with both arms and demanded to be picked up with the absolute authority of a child who has never once been denied something she truly needed. She had dark hair now, thick and wild, and her mother's eyes, Grace's eyes too, the Lawson eyes deep brown and direct, and a laugh that came out of her like something bright breaking loose, and she said things now, real things, full sentences that arrived without warning and landed with the precision of small truths. She said them to Grace. She said them to the horses. She said them to Mrs. Hennessy, who had become a regular presence at the farm table over 3 years. A shift in allegiance so complete that she seemed to have entirely forgotten she had ever stood in Samuel's kitchen looking at Grace with that sharp assessing eye. And she said them to Samuel. She called him Mr. Sam, which was how it had started. Grace had explained to her carefully when Lily first began forming names that his name was Mr. Mallister, and Lily had looked at her with the polite incomprehension of a 2-year-old and said Mr. Sam, and it had stuck, and Samuel had not corrected it, not once. Until the morning in April when everything changed. Grace was at the kitchen table with her school books. Samuel had come in from the early chores and was washing his hands at the basin, and Lily came running in from the back hallway at full speed. The way she did, everything caught herself on Samuel's leg, looked up at him with those Lawson eyes, and said as plainly and simply as she said anything, "Papa, hungry." The room stopped. Samuel stood at the basin with his hands still in the water, and he did not move. Grace looked up from her book. Lily looked between them both with the serene patience of someone who has made a perfectly reasonable request and is waiting for the grown-ups to catch up. "Papa," she said again, because she was 3, and repetition was a tool she trusted completely. "Hungry now." Samuel turned off the water. He dried his hands. He crossed to the bread box and cut 2 slices and spread them with butter, and set them on the table in front of Lily, who climbed into her chair and began eating with absolute satisfaction, entirely unaware that she had just broken something open that had been sealed for 4 years. Samuel turned and walked out the back door. Grace waited exactly 30 seconds. Then she set down her pen and followed him. He was standing in the yard with his back to the house and his hands at his sides and his head down, and she knew before she got close enough to see his face what she was going to find there, because she had never once in 3 years seen Samuel Mallister be anything other than completely contained, and what she heard when she got close enough was the sound of a man breathing in a way that meant he was working very hard to keep himself from doing something else entirely. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, the way he had stood beside her the day she faced Prudence Whitfield on the porch, not in front, not behind, just there. After a while he said roughly, "Give me a minute." "Take all the time you need," she said. He did not need much. He was not the kind of man who needed much. But he needed that minute, and she gave it to him, and when he turned around, his face was the same as it always was, except for something around his eyes that was not quite dry. "She didn't know what she was saying," he said. "She knew exactly what she was saying," Grace said. "She's 3, not simple." He looked at her. "She meant it," Grace said. "She has meant it for a long time. She just found the word." She paused. "You've been her papa since December 3 years ago. She just told you." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. The morning went on around them. Birds wind the sound of Duchess shifting in the barn. "Clara would have—" He started and stopped. It was the first time he had said her name to Grace, in 3 years. "Tell me about her," Grace said. He looked out across the yard. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, "She was small, smaller than you are now. She had red hair and she laughed like Lily. He stopped again. Something moved through him. She was an orphan, taken in by a family in Platte County when she was about your age. They weren't bad people, but they weren't right for her either. She raised herself mostly same way you did. A long pause. Same exact way. Grace understood then. She understood all of it, the way he had hesitated at the door that December night, and then opened it all the way he had looked at her, and known the way he had never made her feel like a burden or a charity case or a problem to be managed. He had opened the door for her because he had loved a woman who had once been standing on the other side of a door just like it, and that love had taught him what it looked like when someone needed a chance more than they needed anything else. She would have liked you, he said, and it was not a platitude. It was a fact stated plainly the way he stated everything. She would have liked you a great deal. I think I would have liked her too, Grace said. He nodded once. Then he straightened, rolled his shoulders back, put himself back together the way he always did, not by hiding anything, but by picking it up and carrying it, which was different. Breakfast, he said. Lily's already eating, Grace said. Then I better get in there before she finishes mine. They went back inside, and Lily looked up from her bread with butter on her chin and said, Papa, again, pointing at his empty chair, and Samuel sat down in it and said, I'm here. And that was that. And that was everything. The letter came in May. It came from a law office in Lincoln, not Caldwell, not anyone Grace recognized, and it was addressed to Samuel, and Forsyth's name was on the cover as a forwarding notation, which told Grace, before she opened it, that Forsyth already knew what was in it and had decided they needed to see it directly. She read it twice at the kitchen table before Samuel came in from the barn, and by the second time she had the whole shape of it in her head. A company called Continental Land and Rail had filed a survey claim on a parcel of land in Cedar County that matched in its legal description the Coleridge property. The letter was formal and courteous, and entirely clear they intended to pursue acquisition of that parcel through the county land office. They were informing the current deed holders as a courtesy. Courtesy. Grace set the letter down and looked at it. When Samuel came in, she handed it to him without a word and watched him read it. His face did not change. It never changed when he was reading something that mattered. He went very still, the way he went, still in the barn, when something was wrong with one of the horses, that particular stillness of complete attention. He set the letter down. Railroad, he said. Or land speculators using the railroad as a front, Grace said. There's no survey notice filed in this county. I checked Forsyth's copy of the county records he sent last fall. That parcel isn't in any active survey. Samuel looked at her. How do you know about county survey records? I've been studying law for 2 years, Grace said. Miss Abernathy orders books from Lincoln for me. A pause. I told you I meant it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you want to do? She had been waiting for that question. She had been ready for it since the second time she read the letter. I want to write back, she said. Not through Forsyth, not through another lawyer. I want to write back myself, in my name as the deed holder. She looked at him steadily. I'm 13. I can't file in court yet, but I can write a letter. And I can make it clear that this land has a living present owner who knows exactly what it is worth, and exactly what the law says about acquiring it. Samuel picked up the letter again. Read it once more. Set it down. Write the letter, he said. She wrote it that evening. She wrote it at the kitchen table while Samuel sat across from her reading, and Lily played on the floor between them with the wooden figures Samuel had carved for her over the winter, a horse, a cow, a small figure that Lily called Gracie and carried everywhere. Grace wrote 3 drafts. She threw away the first 2. The third one was exactly what she wanted, precise, informed completely, without anger, which was its own kind of power. She read it to Samuel when she was done. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Second paragraph, the part about the Cedar County Surveyor's Office. Add the specific statute. The one about prior recording superseding survey claims. Grace looked at him. You've been reading law too. Somebody in this house had to keep up with you, he said. She laughed a real laugh, sudden and uncomplicated, the kind she had not known how to make in December 3 years ago, and had learned in the slow, ordinary days of this life. And she added the statute to the second paragraph and signed the letter, Grace Eleanor Lawson, and addressed it to the law office in Lincoln. She mailed it on a Saturday. The reply came 3 weeks later. The survey claim had been withdrawn. Continental Land and Rail had determined that the parcel in question was not available for acquisition. She read the letter at the kitchen table. She folded it along its creases. She put it in the file with all the other documents, the deed, the will, the guardianship papers, the court record, the memos from Forsyth, the record she had built word by word and page by page over 3 years. The file was thick now. It was the thickest single document she owned. She put it back in its place in the cabinet and shut the drawer. Then she went to the barn where Samuel was working on the fence that ran the east side of the property, and she said, "They withdrew." He did not stop working. He drove one more nail before he looked at her. "Good," he said. "Just good. What do you want me to say?" "Something more than good," Grace said. "We won again." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was everything a smile is made of, moved across it and settled. "You won," he said. "I just kept up." She took the hammer from his hand, lined up the next nail herself, and drove it clean. The summer that Lily turned 4, she started following the horses with a determination so complete that Samuel finally began teaching her their names and their habits, holding her up so she could touch their noses. Explaining in the slow, patient way, he explained everything, that Duchess was contrary on her left side, but gentle on her right, that the gray gelding liked apples more than carrots, that the young roan was still learning and needed to be talked to quiet. Lily absorbed all of it with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything important. She was Grace's sister, in that way absolutely her mother's daughter, and her sister's sister, and something entirely herself as well. She called Samuel Papa every day now, without thought, without ceremony, the way children name the permanent things in their lives. And Samuel answered to it every time the same way, present, certain, with the particular solidity of a man who has decided what he is and has stopped arguing with himself about it. One evening in late summer, Grace was sitting on the porch steps when Samuel came and sat beside her. They sat in the easy quiet they had built between them over 3 years of early mornings and hard work and honest words, and the light was going long and gold across the yard, and somewhere behind them in the house, Lily was singing something to herself that was not quite a song, but had the shape of one. "Mr. Mallister," Grace said. "You've been calling me that for 3 years," he said. "You can call me Samuel." She considered that. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe when I'm older." He made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Fair enough. I've been thinking," she said, "about the Coleridge land. I figured you would be. Lily's too young to decide anything about it yet, but I've been thinking that when she's old enough, we should ask her together what she wants to do with it." She paused. "Mama left it to both of us. It should be both of us who decide." "And in the meantime," Samuel said. "In the meantime," Grace said, "I want to pay a man in Coleridge to keep the fence up and the brush clear. I want it to be in good order when we make that decision." She looked at him sideways. "I'll pay for it out of my own wages." "You don't draw wages," he said. "Then it's past time we fix that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 15 cents a week." 50, Grace said. 20. 40. 25 ta, he said, and room and board included. Grace looked at him. The long light was on his face, and he was looking out at the yard with the expression she had come to know as his version of contentment. Not happy the way easy people are happy, but something deeper and more hard-won, the satisfaction of a man who has rebuilt something from the inside out and found it sound. "Deal," she said. He nodded once. They shook on it formally, the way they had shaken on things since the beginning, as equals, as people whose word meant what it said. Mrs. Hennessy came for supper 3 nights later, the way she did most weeks now, and she brought a jar of preserves and a piece of news from town that she delivered with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to say it all the way over. Judge Harmon was retiring. A new judge was coming in from Omaha. Young people said. Fair-minded. Grace listened to this with the careful attention she brought to anything that touched the county's legal structures. "What's his name?" she asked. "Whitmore," Mrs. Hennessy said. "James Whitmore. Forsyth knows him apparently. Says he's a good man." Grace filed this information in the part of her mind that kept track of such things. Then she passed the bread and moved the conversation along, because supper was on the table, and Lily was already in her chair with her spoon ready and her patience entirely used up. After supper, after Lily was in bed, and Mrs. Hennessy had gone home and the dishes were put away, Grace stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard in the dark, at the gate that hung straight and closed clean at the fence line that ran solid and sure across the edge of their land. She thought about a girl who had walked 30 miles in December carrying everything she had left. She thought about an 8th door, the last door, the one she had hit with her frozen fist, because she had run out of options and not out of will. She thought about what it means to ask for work instead of mercy, to stand up straight when every door has closed on you, to keep going. Not because you are sure it will be all right, but because you are not willing to find out what happens if you stop. Samuel came and stood beside her at the window. He looked out at the same dark yard. "You all right?" he said. "I'm good," Grace said. And she meant it the way she meant everything, completely without reservation, with the full weight of someone who knows exactly what those words are worth, because she has lived through what it costs to be able to say them. He put his hand on the top of her head for a moment. Not a child's pat, not condescending, just the gesture of a man who has run out of words for something and has found a different way to say it. Then he took his coffee cup and went to his chair and picked up his book, and the fire went on burning, and the gate stood straight outside in the dark, and somewhere down the hall, Lily was breathing the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who has never once doubted that she is loved. Grace Lawson was 13 years old, and she had walked through the worst winter of her life and knocked on every door that presented itself, and she had found behind the last one not charity, not pity, not a temporary shelter, but something that could not be taken from her by a court or a railroad or a woman with a leather-case lawyer and a letter sealed in dark wax. She had found a family. Not the one she was born into, that one was gone, and the grief of that would always be real, and she would carry it the way she carried everything, honestly, and without pretending it weighed less than it did. But the family she had built, the one that had been built around her, the one held together not by blood, but by daily choice, by showing up, by opening doors, when closing them would have been easier. That family was hers, in the way that nothing taken by force or circumstance can ever be undone. The crooked gate was straight. The cold farmhouse was warm. The man in the chair by the fire had taught himself slowly and imperfectly, and at considerable cost to his own peace, how to let someone in again. And the little girl sleeping down the hall had given him a name he would carry for the rest of his life, and he had not corrected it, not once, because it was right, and they both knew it, and some truths do not need to be argued into existence. They already are. They have always already been. You just have to be brave enough to walk toward them through the snow. That was what Grace Lawson had been. That was what she would always be. And it had been, in the end, more than enough.